Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke. I am your sick host. I'm sorry about my voice. I've come down with something the last few days, but we'll make it through. Today's chapter is Genesis chapter 15. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the follow button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 15 has 21 verses. Let's go ahead and read the text. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven, and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So that is the text of Genesis chapter 15. I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, go out to our website and download the free PDF that has all of our key information on it. It's totally free. You can download all of the chapters of Genesis. They should all be available unless some of the links are broken, but I don't think they are, at least not for Genesis. If you would like to, you don't want to go out and grab all the links and download them or print them. What you can do is go on Amazon. There's a link in the description. We have a physical book that has all of the outlines for Genesis already in full color, printed off for you in physical form. So either way, I'd encourage you to go grab that. That will help you to keep everything straight. Or maybe if you're listening to this while you're driving or something like that, you might want to go out and get those outlines later and compile them. That way you have some reference material to come back to and remind yourself what you studied. Before we actually get into the text of Genesis chapter 15, let's, as we always do, talk about some context. So in chapters 11 and 12, we were introduced to this guy named Abram. We talked about how we're going to be following him and his family really throughout the rest of the Old Testament. God makes Abram some significant promises, and these promises come in a couple different parts. And we're going to talk about that more today, but let's remind ourselves of what those promises were. So first of all, we have Abram being promised that his descendants are going to turn into a great nation of people. Abram's got some questions about that, which he brings up in chapter 15. The second part of the promise was that the land of Canaan, the land in which Abram was living now, was eventually going to be given to his descendants, and all of that was going to belong to them. And then finally, we're told that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through Abram, and we've talked about how that will ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus, who comes to bless all nations and all people by dealing with the sin and death problem that is afflicting the entire world at this point. Now, as we get into chapter 15 and we turn to our PDF and the information that's contained there, we are going to talk about this promise some more. Abram needs some confirmation that these things are actually going to happen, and there does seem to be one really significant roadblock to this happening, which Abram brings up in this chapter. Hopefully you caught it as we were reading through. But let's go ahead, first of all, on our first page, let's talk about when these events happen, who our main characters are, and where they happen. Abram was born in approximately 1996 BC, before Christ, and he died in 1821 BC, so he lived 175 years. The events that are recorded in Genesis 15 happened sometime between Abram's 75th and 100th birthday, between 921 and 896 BC. As we go down to our characters section for this chapter, obviously we have God is the main character. I guess you could technically say that in every chapter of the Bible. But other than him, we just pretty much have Abram. He's the only one who's mentioned here and is featured, I guess, in this chapter. You could also include this man named Eliezer of Damascus, who we read about, who seems to be a servant in Abram's household. But let's talk about Abram and reintroduce him in case anyone is just jumping into the study here. Abram was a man from Ur of the Chaldeans who moved to Canaan at God's instructions. God promised to make his descendants a great nation and to give them the land of Canaan. So that pretty much does it for our character section today. Now let's talk about where. This chapter is a little bit of a mystery as far as where these specific events played out. Genesis 15 recounts how God appears to Abram in a vision, but we aren't told specifically where that vision occurred. As we get towards the end of Genesis 15, I will have a few comments on some geographic locations that are said to mark the borders or the boundaries of this promised land that was going to be given to Abram's descendants. So we'll hold off on those for the time being. But as far as this vision that Abram receives from God, we don't know exactly where this happened. Let's go over to our outline section now and break the chapter down, make sure we understand what we just read. I've got the chapter broken into two different parts. The first one is verses 1 through 7. God promises Abram that he'll give him many children. After God appears to Abram in a vision, reaffirming these promises to him, Abram expresses his concern with God's promise to make him a great nation because he and Sarai, they don't have any children. Sarai is barren. She doesn't have a son. She doesn't even have a daughter. And Abram says that the man who's in line to inherit his things, his household, is this man Eliezer of Damascus, who's evidently one of his servants. And so Abram might be asking here, he says, Lord, how is this promise going to work? Is it my household, my line just going to representatively pass down through Eliezer? Because, at the moment, it doesn't look like it's going to be passing down through any of my biological children because I don't have any biological children. God's response is to reassure Abram that no, this is not going to representatively pass down through Eliezer. You are going to have a biological son. You and Sarai together. I'm going to make this happen. And though you don't have any children now, your children eventually are going to be equal to the number of the stars in heaven. Just like he talked about Abram's descendants being like the dust of the ground. Obviously, no one can count the dust of the ground. And so God's saying, you're going to have so many descendants, no one's even going to be able to count them. So he's reassuring Abram that he is going to have a natural child. And to Abram's credit, the text says that he believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. So we see God blessing and commending Abraham for his faith. This is a hard thing to believe. You're getting old. Your wife is past childbearing age. God says, don't worry, you're going to have a child. And Abram says, okay, Lord, I trust you. And God commends him for that faith. This brings us to the second part of the chapter, and this is the really curious part, verses 18 through 21. God promises Canaan to Abram's descendants. So we see in the first part a promise of a son and a promise of a great descendants. And then in the second part, we see a reaffirmation of God's promise to give his descendants the land of Canaan. Abram asks the Lord how he can be sure that his descendants are going to receive this land that God is promising to them. And God seemingly here uses a custom of the day to essentially sign a contract with Abram to reaffirm him with this ancient custom that he is going to keep this promise. He's given it to him verbally already, and now he's kind of sealing the deal. He's giving his oath. God told him to take a heifer, a female goat, a ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon and cut them in half, except for the birds. So why does he tell him to do this? This sounds like some kind of like weird pagan practice. But from what I've read in my research, this is the way that people used to make promises. And this is actually reaffirmed by another passage much later in the Old Testament. If you have a Bible handy, you might want to turn over to Jeremiah chapter 34 and verse 18 through 20, where God is condemning a group of people for breaking their covenant, and he uses some similar language to what we see here. So it's Jeremiah chapter 34. Let me pull it up on my Bible program here. Jeremiah 34, let's read 18 through 20. And the men who transgressed my covenant, God says, and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf. And I will give them into the hands of their enemies and into the hands of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. So God tells Abram, take all these animals, cut them in half, lay them on the ground, and then later we're going to see God passing through and making his covenant, reaffirming his covenant. And this seems to be what people did in this day. They'd cut animals in half, lay them on either side, then they would pass through, perhaps repeating the words of the covenant as they passed through. And I think the idea here is that if you break the promise, you end up like the animal. Right, laying dead on the ground, is blood spilled on the ground. Maybe even as Jeremiah says, that you're food for the birds and the wild animals if you break the promise. And so in a way, you're kind of speaking a curse over yourself so that you will keep the oath that you're making. And so this seems to be what's happening here. And God is just using a custom that they practiced to affirm to Abraham that he's serious about this promise. And obviously, God doesn't lie. God doesn't break his promises. So he uses this to assure Abram. Let's see how this plays out now. Abram did as God instructed. And that night, God caused him to fall asleep and to experience a, quote, dreadful and great darkness. So God is going to reaffirm this covenant with him, this promise, but there's some bad news that's also associated with this promise. He's going to give Abram some more information about what's going to happen to his descendants in the future, and it's not all good. It's not all promises of blessings and happiness. There's some bad that's going to go on here. So that may be why he experiences this dreadful and great darkness. Abraham was told that his offspring would be strangers in another land that did not belong to them, and there they would suffer for 400 years. But after the 400 years, it says that they would leave with, quote, great possessions. All right, so what are we talking about here? What is this 400 years? When are Abram's family, when are they going to be oppressed in a foreign nation and then leave with great possessions? Well, if you know the story of the Bible, you may already know how this plays out. If you don't, that's fine. We're going to talk about it. And there's no reason to worry if you don't understand it all right now. But for those who know the book of Exodus, what's being talked about here is Abram's descendants, the nation of Israel, the children of Jacob, going down into Egypt, and they're becoming slaves for decades upon decades, slaves of the Egyptians. And then only when Moses comes along on the scene in the book of Exodus are they're going to make their exit, their exodus from Egypt, and they're going to leave with great possessions because God is going to cause the Egyptians to give them great possessions. And then they're slowly going to make their way back to the promised land, to Canaan, to inherit the blessing, to receive the fulfillment of the promise that's made to Abraham. So we've got, what we find out here is that it's going to be hundreds of years before Abram's descendants inherit this land. And there's going to be some struggle in those hundreds of years, namely a period of enslavement in a foreign country. That's not good news, right? But after that's done, then, and only then, will Abram's descendants finally get this land. Abram is looking for a confirmation. He gets his confirmation, but he also gets some bad news as well. All right, so maybe a question in your mind is, why do we have to wait? Why do we have to wait for 400 years? Why didn't God just give Abram the land now? He's already there. He can just have some children, and he's already got 318 men, we know, in his personal military. He's already able to defeat Chedorlaomer and his army that captured Lot. Like, why don't we have Abram just go ahead and conquer the land right now? Well, there is actually a reason for this, and this shows us God's larger plan and the way that he's working amongst the nations, and that his timing and when he allows things and why he allows things to happen and to play out the way that they do. God was going to delay the inheritance of Canaan by Abram's descendants for 400 years. The reason he gives is because the Amorites are a group of people who live in Canaan, and he says that the Amorites are not yet wicked enough for God to cast them out. And so this 400-year period is giving the Amorites time not to move in the right direction, but to move in the wrong direction. They're going to become increasingly more and more wicked in this 400 years, and there's going to come a point where God is ready to judge them. He's going to be patient with them. He's going to have grace on them. He's going to allow them to remain for centuries, but eventually he knows the future. He knows the way that people are going to behave. He knows the way that nations are going to act. And he says, when they're wicked enough, then I'll give you the land. But I'm going to wait for that. There are just all kinds of lessons that we can learn from this. Too many to go over in this study. But one to think about is that there is a point at which a nation becomes so wicked that God brings judgment on them. Now, we kind of saw that already, actually not on a nation, but on the whole world when God brought about the flood. But what we see here is kind of this judgment happening in a smaller region. This is just one country, and he allows them to exist for a period of time, even knowing the way that they're going to act. He's gracious, he's patient with them, he's long-suffering with them, but there's a point at which he says, enough is enough, and now I'm going to use another nation to bring you down. Another lesson that we can learn is, I think, important because of some critiques that you sometimes hear of the Bible. Sometimes you hear about the Israelites, who are Abram's family, conquering the land of Canaan and the inhabitants there and killing the people that are there. And critics of the scriptures love to say, oh, how cruel God's people were. How terrible they were. God just comes in and wipes all these people out. How horrible is that? What we learn from this passage is that, no, this was not as if God just on a whim decided to kill some people that were, generally good people. There's 400 years. That's 4 centuries. That's longer than my nation, the United States, has even been around. There's 400 years of God's patience, and it's only then that he decides to judge those people. And so what we see in the conquest of Canaan is not a God who just willy-nilly goes in and wipes out a nation of people because he decides that they need to be, exterminated from the earth. No, this is a nation that God has had incredible amounts of patience with, but there is a time when he will judge evildoers. Find that out from the flood. We find that out many times in the Old Testament. As the chapter concludes, we get a few more details about this land promise that's being made. We have some borders kind of drawn out here. God says that he's going to give Abraham's children the land from the river of Egypt to the great river. Now, where are these two places? You might think you know where the river of Egypt is, but I know personally I got this wrong when I initially thought of it. You think of the river of Egypt, you think the Nile River, right? It's the symbol of Egypt. But I think actually what we're talking about here is not the Nile River. The river of Egypt here refers to the Wadi al-Arish, which is a wadi is a valley or a ravine that's dry for a lot of the year, but then during the rainy season, it fills up with water and it becomes a river. So this seems to be what's being referred to here, not the Nile River. God's not saying that he's going to give the people of Israel all the land all the way down to the Nile. The Wadi al-Arish is kind of a rough idea, is kind of halfway between the borders of Egypt and the lower part of Canaan. So the river of Egypt, the Wadi al-Arish, is the southern border, but we also have a northern border, the Great River. What's the Great River? I think some translations just have it as the Euphrates. Now, if you know, the Euphrates is hundreds of miles to the north of what is displayed on our map. It's hundreds of miles to the north of what we traditionally think of as the promised land or Canaan or what was divided up amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. So why does God say here that he's going to give them all of this land? Some people say, well, that there was never a point at which Israel controlled all the way up to the Euphrates, but it's actually not true. There is a period during Solomon, and there's also another king who has military engagements all the way up at the Euphrates River. So during Solomon's period, all of this land and territory was under the control of Israel. So yes, God did give all of this land into their hand at certain points in their history. Now we know that their kingdom kind of shrank up and it expanded and shrank based in part on the people's faithfulness to God. During Solomon's day, which was kind of the high time of the kingdom of Israel, its golden years, all of this land was managed by Solomon's military. So that is our study for today in Genesis chapter 15. I have a feeling I ran a little long on this one, maybe rambled a little too much. I'm always trying to find a balance between making this something that's really good for beginners, someone who's just getting into the scriptures and maybe reading it for the first time, and then others who kind of know the story and are now reading it again and trying to put all of these pieces into the history that they already know about and figure out how all these connections are made. So that's kind of a challenge, and I'm doing my best, but we'll try to refine it even more as we go through in the upcoming days. Thanks everybody for having patience with me as I'm starting out this podcast. I've really enjoyed making it. It's nice to be able to refresh my memory on the book of Genesis, and every time you go through, even though I've read Genesis, I don't know how many times, you see things and you make connections and you appreciate it more and more. So now let's talk about our application as we finish up for today. God's promises aren't always accomplished quickly, but they are always kept to the fullest degree. Abram received some promises that were way out in the future, but even the promise to have a son, that's not going to be realized for years to come. And we see in the meantime, Sarai and Abram getting a little anxious and wondering if God's really going to keep this promise and trying to take things into their own hands. They maybe have some questions as to whether God's promises are really all that trustworthy or how they're going to be fulfilled. What they should have done is just sit back and say, I don't understand why God hasn't fulfilled this promise yet, but he's going to. And this is what I know. And that's what we need to learn. Walking in obedience to God requires patience a lot of times. You can't rush the eternal. We live maybe 80 years if we're lucky. It's not all that much time. We want things to happen quickly, but God's eternal. He's not in a hurry the way that we are. And it's important for us to learn that God's timetable is always the best timetable. If things don't happen as quickly as we want them to or expect them to, we should just sit back and say, well, Lord, I guess you've got this figured out, and I don't. And I really was hoping that this would be settled by now, but it's not. And so that takes a huge amount of trust to be like, well, I'm going to trust that God knows better than me. And even in my own life right now, I'm like, come on, let's hurry this thing up and resolve these problems that we have. And I want some answers as soon as possible, right? But really what I should be doing is sitting back and saying, God's going to work this out when he chooses to, and whatever his timetable is better than the one that I dreamed up in my head. Living on God's schedule is exactly the right pace for our lives. Easier said than applied, but it is necessary to apply to live the Christian life faithfully. So that is our study in Genesis chapter 15. Thanks for joining me again, and Lord willing, we'll be back again tomorrow to talk about chapter 16.